She pretended to be barren to escape the rival pack until the Alpha King scented the twin heirs. She carried. Celine pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the storage room and held her breath. Outside, heavy boots scraped across the wooden floor of the hall. There were at least 4 of them. She could tell by the sound. 4 Bloodmore wolves, moving through the Ironclaw settlement like they owned it, like they already did. She had maybe 2 minutes before they reached this corridor. She closed her eyes and counted her heartbeat. Steady. She needed it steady. She could not afford to panic, could not afford to let her sense spike with fear, because these were trained trackers, and they would notice. They always noticed. The settlement had been placed under inspection at dawn. That was the word the Bloodmore Beta had used when he announced it to the gathered pack members in the courtyard. Inspection. As if they were livestock. As if the women standing in that cold morning air were nothing more than inventory to be sorted and catalogued. Celine had stood in the 3rd row, shoulders back, chin level, wearing the face she had practiced for months. Pale, drawn, a little vacant behind the eyes. The face of a woman who had already given up on something. She was good at that face now. It had taken time, but she had mastered it. The inspectors moved down the rows with a healer from Bloodmore at their side. The healer was a woman named Greta, well into her 50s, with sharp eyes and hands that moved quickly. She pressed 2 fingers to each woman's wrist and held them there for a count of 5. She could read pulse rhythms, hormone shifts, the quiet internal music of a body that was alive with fertility. Celine had known about Greta 3 weeks before the Bloodmore pack ever arrived. She had made preparations. The preparation had cost her almost everything she had saved. 4 silver coins, a handwritten letter, and a debt she would spend years repaying. The elder healer of the Ironclaw pack, an old man named Dorian who had known Celine since she was a child, had agreed to alter her record in the settlement registry. Not falsify, that was not how he had said it. He had called it a correction, made with mercy, for a woman with no other road left to walk. The registry said she was barren, had been since a childhood illness stripped her of the possibility. It was the kind of record no one questioned, because no one wanted to ask the questions that would follow. Barren women were invisible to Bloodmore. They wanted strength, health, and the promise of offspring. A woman who could not give them that was of no use. They would pass her by without a second look. Greta had passed her by. Celine had kept her breath controlled, her eyes forward, her face blank. The healer's gaze had landed on her for exactly 2 seconds, then moved on. Dismissed, discarded, just as planned. But then one of the Bloodmore trackers had paused halfway down the row. A big man with a shaved head and a jaw like a quarry stone. He had tilted his head in Celine's direction. Just slightly, his nostrils had flared. She had felt it like a blade pressed against her ribs. He had stared at her for a long moment. She had not moved, had not blinked any faster than usual, had kept every muscle in her body from trembling by sheer force of will. And after what felt like an entire season passing, he had turned away and followed the others down the line. She had thought it was over. It was not over. That was why she was now in the storage room, listening to those boots get closer, pressing her hand flat against her abdomen in the darkness. Not out of fear, out of something much more fierce and animal than fear. She was 6 weeks along. She had known for 4 of those weeks. The twins had not announced themselves with sickness or sudden cravings, as some pregnancies did. They had announced themselves with a sound. A low, almost imagined hum that she felt rather than heard, deep in her chest, just before sleep each night. She had gone to Dorian quietly, said nothing to anyone else. He had confirmed it with careful hands and a look on his face that was equal parts wonder and worry. 2, he had said, both strong. She had not cried. She had simply nodded, thanked him, and walked home in the dark, turning the information over in her mind, the way one might turn a stone in a river, looking at every surface, every sharp edge and smooth one. She had made the decision to protect them the only way she knew how, before she even reached her door that night. The boots stopped outside the storage room. Celine did not move. A voice spoke in low tones. One of the trackers, he was saying something about a trail, about a scent that did not match the registry. She heard the word verify, and her blood went cold. She calculated. The door was wooden, light, and it would not hold against a wolf's strength for more than a breath. There was a small window on the far wall, set high, barely wide enough for her shoulders. The drop on the other side was into the herb garden, soft ground. She had noted that when she chose this room. She was already moving toward the window before she finished the thought. She was not a fighter. She never had been, but she was clever, and she was fast, and she had spent her entire life learning how to disappear from rooms that wanted to hold her. She pulled herself up by the sill, angled sideways, and dropped. The landing was harder than she expected. Her palms hit the soil and she rolled, came up onto her feet, and did not stop moving. She crossed the herb garden at a run, ducked under the fence line at the far end, and pressed herself into the narrow alley between the grain store and the eastern wall. She stayed there for a long time, listening, waiting. No one came. When the settlement finally went quiet again, when the Bloodmore wolves had moved on to other tasks and the inspectors had gathered their records and begun their afternoon meal, Celine walked slowly back to her small house at the edge of the territory and sat down on the floor inside her front door. She pressed both hands to her middle. She breathed. They were still there, both of them. That quiet hum, steady and sure. She had known from the beginning that this lie would cost her something enormous. She had understood, even as she handed Dorian those 4 silver coins, that she was making a trade she could not undo, but she had looked at every other option, turned each one over in the light, and found them all wanting. She could not run. A lone pregnant woman in the open lands between pack territories was a target, not a fugitive. She could not appeal to the Ironclaw Alpha for protection, because the Ironclaw Alpha had already agreed to the Bloodmore inspection in exchange for a trade agreement he needed badly. She could not reveal the pregnancy to anyone who might accidentally reveal it to anyone else, and she could not, under any circumstances, let it reach the ears of the one person who had a right to know, because that person was Caden Rain, and Caden Rain was the Alpha King. She had told herself, in the months since that night at the ceasefire summit, that what had happened between them was an accident of circumstance, 2 people in the wrong place at the wrong moment, drawn together by something neither of them had chosen or anticipated. She had told herself it meant nothing lasting, that he would not remember her clearly, that kings had responsibilities she could not imagine, and that those responsibilities left no room for a woman like her. She had told herself all of this so many times that she had almost believed it. But the twins she now carried were proof that she had been telling herself a story, not a truth. She closed her eyes in the dark of her small house. Outside, she could hear the Bloodmore wolves laughing over their meal. She could hear the settlement resuming its ordinary sounds, women calling to children, a hammer striking metal in the forge yard, the creak of the water wheel at the northern stream. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life continuing around the extraordinary thing she was hiding. She had gotten through today. That was what mattered. She would get through tomorrow, too. And the day after that, and the day after that, and every day for as long as it took, because the 2 small lives humming inside her had no one else to depend on. No shield, no name, no pack standing behind them. Only her. Only the lie she wore like armor, and the stubborn, unshakable certainty that she would not let anyone take what was hers. She did not know that 6 months later, a man with a crown he carried like a weight would arrive at the border of this very territory. She did not know that he would tilt his head in the morning air and go completely still. She did not know that he would recognize the scent of something that belonged to him long before he ever saw her face. She did not know any of it yet. All she knew, in the quiet of that evening, was that she was still standing. For now, that was enough. The summit had been arranged 3 weeks in advance, and Caden Rain had refused to attend it 4 separate times. His lead general, a broad-shouldered man named Owen, who had served the Rain line for 20 years, had stood in the doorway of the war room on the morning of the 5th request and simply said nothing. He had placed the invitation on the table, crossed his arms, and waited. Caden had looked at the parchment for a long moment. Then he had looked at Owen. Then he had looked out the tall window at the gray sky beyond the kingdom walls, and somewhere in that gray sky, something had shifted. Not in his mind. Lower than that. In the part of him that he did not discuss at strategy meetings. He had said, fine. He would go. Owen had wisely left the room before Caden could change his mind. The journey to the Ironclaw territory took 2 days at a fast pace. Caden rode at the front of his escort column, which was small by royal standards. 6 guards, Owen, and a healer named Philip who came on every diplomatic journey because Caden refused to travel with a full-court retinue and someone needed to have bandages. Caden had not brought banners, he had not sent announcement riders ahead. He had specifically told Owen that he wanted no fanfare. Owen had arranged modest fanfare anyway, because that was Owen's job. By the time they crossed into Ironclaw territory on the morning of the second day, the settlement elders were already gathered at the border to receive them, looking simultaneously relieved and panicked, which was the standard expression of anyone receiving an unannounced royal visit. Caden shook hands with the Ironclaw Alpha, a man named Gregory who was older than he looked and shrewder than he let on. He accepted the formal welcome, made the appropriate remarks, and allowed himself to be escorted toward the main hall, where the summit would take place over the following 2 days. He was halfway along the eastern road through the settlement when he stopped walking. Not slowed. Stopped. Completely. Owen, who had been 2 steps behind, nearly walked into him. He steadied himself and began to say something. Then he looked at Caden's face and did not say anything at all. Caden stood in the middle of the road and breathed in. It was faint, carried on the wind from somewhere to the east, already fraying at the edges as it reached him, mixed with wood smoke and dried herbs, and the general layered complexity of a settlement that had many people living close together. But underneath all of that, clear as a struck bell, was something that stopped every other thought in his head. He knew that scent. He had been searching for it, without quite admitting that was what he was doing, for 14 months. And beneath it, 2 other threads. Quieter, newer, his. He turned his head slowly toward the east. The market quarter was visible at the end of a side road, women moving between stalls, voices calling prices and making offers. An ordinary morning market in an ordinary settlement. He stood there for another full breath. Then he said, very quietly, so that only Owen could hear, "Find me the woman who was just in the eastern market. She left recently, probably in a hurry. Do not send soldiers. Do not make it official. Send someone ordinary who can ask ordinary questions, and tell them not to frighten her." Owen stared at him. Caden looked at him steadily. Owen turned and walked away without another word, because that was also his job. The summit began an hour later. Caden sat at the head of the long table and listened to the Ironclaw Alpha present his territory disputes and trade proposals. The Bloodmore Beta, a lean man named Conrad, who had the particular kind of confidence that came from being the second most powerful person in a room, presented his own agenda with smooth efficiency. Other pack representatives spoke in turn. Caden responded when necessary, asked questions that revealed he had read every briefing document he had been given, and kept his face arranged in the expression of careful, measured authority that he had spent years learning to wear. Underneath that expression, he was not calm at all. It was 40 minutes into the summit when the door at the far end of the hall opened slightly, and a young attendant slipped in, crossing quietly to Owen's chair and leaning down to murmur in his ear. Owen's expression did not change. He was very good at that, but his eyes moved to Caden's for a fraction of a second. Caden felt his jaw tighten. She had been in the market. She had left, quickly, when the royal escort arrived. No one knew exactly where she had gone. She was known in the settlement as a healer's assistant, quiet, kept to herself, registered in the settlement records as a barren woman, and therefore considered of low political significance. Low political significance. He nearly laughed. Instead, he nodded once at Owen, returned his gaze to Gregory, who was in the middle of a point about the northern water boundaries, and said something precise and reasonable about arbitration timelines. Inside, the part of him that was not a king and had never been a king was pulling in a direction that had nothing to do with water boundaries. He was patient. He had learned patience the hard way, the way all people who come to power young learn it, through every mistake that impatience caused, and every consequence he had carried afterward. He had learned to sit still when everything in him wanted to move. He had learned to wait. But his wolf had not learned patience. His wolf had been circling the same restless track for 14 months, and now it had caught a scent, and waiting was not something it was prepared to do gracefully. The summit broke for the midday meal. Caden excused himself from the dining hall, told Gregory he needed air, and walked out into the settlement with Owen at his side and 2 guards trailing at a respectful distance. He did not walk toward the eastern market. He walked the long way around, through the quieter residential lanes, watching people go about their midday routines. He was not making himself conspicuous. He was simply moving, letting his senses work the way they did best, not forced, not rushed, but present. The trail was old by now, several hours, but it was hers, and once he had caught it properly in the open air of the settlement, he could follow it the way he could follow almost nothing else. It led him in a wide, instinctive arc toward the southwestern edge of the settlement. Small houses here, modest and neatly kept. A garden of herbs at the end of a row of 3. The scent of dried lavender and something medicinal. And beneath that, close and real now, not distant and fading, the scent that had kept him walking east for 14 months. He stopped outside the 3rd house in the row. Owen stopped behind him. "Give me space," Caden said. Owen gestured discreetly to the 2 guards, and all 3 of them walked back to the lane's far end. Caden stood outside the house. He did not knock immediately. He stood there for a full minute because he was aware, in a way that surprised him with its force, that the next few minutes would determine a very great deal. He needed to be careful. He needed to be honest and careful, and not let the king he was crush the man he needed to be in this moment. He knocked. The silence on the other side of the door was so complete that he knew she was right there, standing still, deciding. He waited. Finally, the door opened. She looked at him the way a person looks at a fire that has gotten bigger than expected, but does not run from, because running would accomplish nothing, and she had already decided that she was done running from fires. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You knew I was here." She said, "I heard your name announced." "Yes." Her voice was calm. That steadiness told him everything about what she had endured. People who had not been through difficulty could not produce a voice like that. He said, "Can I come inside?" She looked at him for a long time. Then she stepped back and held the door. He walked into the small house. She closed the door behind them. The room smelled of her, of herbs and clean wool and something else, something that pulled at him so directly that he had to stand very still for a moment and simply breathe. She stood across the room, her arms at her sides, her chin up. She had dark hair and darker eyes, and she was thinner than he remembered, which said something about the months in between. He said, "How long?" She did not pretend not to understand. She said, 6 weeks since I confirmed it. I found out at 4 weeks. He was quiet. She said, "I know what you're going to ask." He said, "Do you?" She said, "You're going to ask why I didn't find a way to tell you." He said, "I'm going to ask a lot of things, but not in anger. I want to be clear about that before anything else." Something moved across her face, too fast to name, but it was not what he expected. It was not relief, exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone who has been braced for impact for a very long time and has just realized the impact, when it comes, is not the shape they anticipated. She sat down. He sat down across from her. And they began to talk. It was a long conversation. Some of it was difficult. Some of it was the kind of honest that feels like being turned inside out in a cold room. But it was real, and it was careful, and it was the beginning of something neither of them had the language for yet. Outside, the settlement went about its afternoon. The summit continued without its Alpha King for 2 full hours, which caused Gregory significant anxiety and Conrad quiet amusement. Inside a small house at the edge of the southwestern lane, a man who wore a crown and a woman who wore a lie sat across from each other and, for the first time in 14 months, told each other the truth. Celine had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in her head since the morning she heard Caden's name announced at the border. Not this exact conversation. She had not known it would be him sitting across from her table, which had a small crack along one edge and a mug of cold tea she had forgotten to drink. She had not known it would feel like this, like standing in a river current, not swept away, but not still either, moved by something she could not simply step out of. She had rehearsed a version where he was furious. That version had him standing, voice low and controlled, the way powerful people were furious when they had learned to hide it behind quiet. She had prepared for that. She had rehearsed a version where he was disbelieving. That version had him listing every reason the situation could not be what she was saying it was, every alternative, every possibility that did not include the word his. She had even, in her darkest and most honest moments, rehearsed a version where he simply did not care, where a night that had rearranged something fundamental inside her had been, for him, only a ceasefire summit, only a moment that passed. She had not rehearsed the version where he knelt. He did not kneel dramatically. He did not kneel the way stories said kings knelt, with great visible effort and ceremony. He simply lowered himself, one knee to the wooden floor of her small house, and placed his hand flat against her middle, with a gentleness that seemed to cost him nothing, as if that gentleness was just something he carried. She had not moved. She had barely breathed. He had kept his hand there for a long moment, eyes closed, head slightly bowed. Then he had looked up at her and said, "They are strong." She had felt the muscles in her throat do something complicated. She had nodded. He had stayed where he was for another moment. Then he rose, returned to the chair, and looked at her steadily. "Tell me everything," he said. Not the short version. Everything. So she had told him. She started at the beginning, which was not the ceasefire summit. The beginning was 3 months before that, when the rumors about Bloodmore's new alliance strategy had begun moving through neutral pack networks. Whispers at first, then pattern, then specifics. The Bloodmore Alpha was restructuring his territory expansion through what he called fertility bonds, which was a formal name for something that had no formal decency in it. Strong she-wolves, documented as fertile, were being offered as part of alliance agreements. Not asked, offered, by pack leaders who had decided that their female members were a resource to be traded, not people with lives and choices. Celine had heard these whispers in the neutral market town where she worked as a healer's assistant. She had sat with the information for weeks, turning it over, taking it apart, understanding exactly what it meant for women in packs with less protection and more political debt. Then the Bloodmore pack had turned its attention toward Ironclaw. And the Ironclaw Alpha, who was not a cruel man, but was a practical one, with significant trade problems and a flood-damaged northern road, had been willing to negotiate. She had known, from that point, that the inspection was coming. She had gone to Dorian. She had explained what she needed. She had paid the price, and carried the weight of what she was asking him to do, knowing it was a large thing to ask, knowing it could cost him something too, if anyone looked closely. And then the ceasefire summit had happened. She paused when she reached that point in the telling. She had not been planning to go to the summit. She had been planning to remain in the market town and send a written report to the Neutral Healers Collective as she always did. But Philip, the Rain Kingdom's traveling healer, had taken ill with a stomach complaint the day before the summit, and the collective had asked if anyone could assist with medical support for the delegation. She had said yes, because the neutral delegation needed help, and because she was a healer before she was anything else, and because she had not known, at that point, that there was any reason to say no. Caden listened to this without interrupting. His face was very still, not closed, still. There was a difference she was learning as she spoke. She told him about the summit, about the first day, the formal proceedings, the careful diplomatic language, and the careful diplomatic silences. About the second evening, when the proceedings had ended and the tension of 2 days of careful language had left everyone wanting something ordinary. A fire had been lit in the central hall. Someone had found a musician. People had talked and eaten and been, for a few hours, simply people. She told him that she had been standing near the window when he had come to stand near the same window, and that they had talked for a long time about nothing in particular, which had been the most natural conversation she had in years. She did not tell him everything about that evening. She told him enough. The relevant parts. The parts that connected to where they currently were. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "When you left in the morning, was that a choice?" She looked at him. She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because you are the Alpha King, and I am a healer's assistant in a neutral market town, and because I had already begun to understand what was coming for women in Ironclaw territory, and because I had a problem that was about to become significantly more complicated, and because staying would not have fixed any of it." He said, "You could have come to me." She said, "With what? I had no proof of the pregnancy yet. I had no name to give it, and you had a kingdom and 100 political obligations. I was not prepared to throw into chaos on the strength of a single evening and a feeling." He was quiet again. Then he said, "A feeling." She looked at him steadily. She said, "You know exactly what I mean." He held her gaze. He said, "Yes, I do." There was a long pause between them. Outside, a bird moved in the herb garden. Inside, the cold tea sat on the table between them like a small, neutral witness. Then Caden said, "The falsified record, Dorian." She said, "He did it because I asked him to, and because he understood what the alternative was. I take full responsibility for that decision." "It was mine." Caden said, "I am not looking for someone to blame." She said, "I know, but I want to be clear that I made the choice, and I would make it again, because it kept them safe, and that was the only thing that mattered." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, something deep and complicated that she did not have a name for yet. He said, "The tracker who paused in the inspection line, the one who looked at you." She said, "He caught something, I don't know what, not enough to override a falsified registry, but enough to send people to search the storage rooms." Caden said, "He will not be on any further inspection teams." She said, "That's not why I told you." He said, "I know. I am telling you what will happen regardless." She absorbed that, the quiet certainty in it. Not a threat, not a display, simply a fact being placed on the table. She said, "What happens now?" He leaned back slightly. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. He said, "The summit continues tomorrow. I will go back to it. I will sit at that table, and I will conduct myself exactly as expected, because disappearing from diplomatic proceedings raises questions I am not ready to answer publicly yet." She said, "And after the summit?" He said, "After the summit, I would like to ask you to come back with me. To the kingdom, not as a political statement, not as a negotiating tool, as someone who is carrying my children, and who should not be doing so alone, in a settlement with a compromised registry and a Bloodmore tracker who already looked at her twice." She said nothing. He said, "I am asking, not telling. I understand the distinction matters to you, and it matters to me too." She looked at him. She was very tired. She had been tired for months, and she had not been allowing herself to feel it, because tiredness was a luxury she could not afford. But in this room, with this conversation between them, she felt it settle over her shoulders, like something heavy and honest. She said, "Let me think." He nodded. He stood. He moved toward the door, and then paused. He said, "For what it is worth, I remember that evening very clearly. All of it. It was not nothing to me." She did not answer. He opened the door and walked out into the afternoon. She sat for a long time after he left. She pressed her hands to her middle. The hum was there, steady and warm, and utterly indifferent to the complicated politics of the world above it. She thought about what she was going to do. She had been alone with this for 4 months. She had carried it in silence and in hiding, and in the careful performance of a woman who had nothing of value to take. She had been very good at carrying it alone. But the 2 small lives she was carrying had not asked to be carried alone. They had not chosen this. They were simply there, strong and steady, already more real to her than almost anything else she had ever known. She thought about what safe looked like, not what it felt like, what it actually looked like, in practice, in the world as it was. She picked up the cold mug of tea. She held it for a moment without drinking from it. Then she set it down and began to think very carefully about what she was going to say to him in the morning. She did not yet know that she would not have until morning. She did not yet know that before the sun set, a Bloodmore tracker would bring his suspicions to Conrad, and Conrad would bring them to the summit table, and the thing she had been hiding so carefully would stop being something she could manage alone. She did not yet know that the choice of whether to let Caden protect her was about to be taken out of her hands entirely. The knock at her door came 2 hours later. It was not Caden. It was Owen, and the expression on his face told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. She grabbed her bag from the hook by the door. She had packed it 3 months ago, ready for exactly this kind of moment, because she had always known the armor would not hold forever. Owen said, "The king requests your presence at the summit hall, immediately." She said, "Bloodmore." He said, "Yes." She put on her coat. She straightened her spine. She walked out into the evening air with the practiced expression of a woman who was not afraid, even though every part of her was afraid. And she walked toward the summit hall with her hands steady at her sides and her heart going very fast behind her ribs. She did not know what was waiting for her in that hall. She knew only that she was done hiding. The armor was gone. What was left was just her. And somehow, in some way she could not entirely explain, that felt like the most solid ground she had stood on in a long time. The summit hall went quiet the moment Celine walked through the door. Not the quiet of polite attention, the quiet of a room that has just shifted on its axis, and every person in it knows it, though no one has said anything yet. 14 people sat around the long table. Gregory at one end, looking like a man who had woken up expecting a routine morning and found something considerably more complicated waiting for him in the kitchen. Conrad at the other end, leaning back in his chair with the particular ease of someone who believes the conversation is already going their way. And at the center of the long side, Caden, whose face gave nothing away except to Celine, who had spent the last 2 hours studying his expressions closely enough to know that the stillness in his jaw meant he was working very hard to maintain a particular kind of control. She came to stand near the door. Owen positioned himself slightly behind her. She was grateful for that, though she would not have said so. Conrad spoke first. He had a smooth voice, the kind of voice that was always carefully modulated, always implying that the person using it had more information than the person hearing it. He said, "The woman's name is Celine Voss. She is registered in the Iron Claw settlement as a healer's assistant, listed as barren in the official fertility record." He paused. "My tracker believes that record is inaccurate." Gregory cleared his throat. He said, carefully, "The records here are maintained by our senior healer, Dorian, who has served this settlement for 30 years. There is no reason to doubt his documentation." Conrad said, "There is every reason to doubt any documentation that was recently altered, which is what our tracker's report suggests." Gregory's expression tightened, but he did not speak. Celine did not look at Dorian, who was seated along the wall with the other settlement officials. She did not need to look at him to know what his face looked like. Caden said, "What is it that Bloodmore is actually asking for, Conrad?" "Speak plainly." Conrad said, "Plainly. She should have been included in the original inspection. If she was excluded on the basis of an altered record, then the terms of our agreement with Ironclaw have not been met. We are asking for a proper assessment." Caden said, "No." Conrad blinked. Then he smiled, which was worse than the blank expression. He said, "The alliance terms are clear, and both Bloodmore and Ironclaw agreed to them. This is not a matter for the Rain Kingdom to involve itself in." Caden said, "You are wrong about that." Conrad said, "On what grounds?" Caden said, "On the grounds that she is under my protection." The room was very quiet. Gregory looked at the table. Several of the pack representatives exchanged glances. Conrad's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes did, a recalculation, quick and sharp. He said, "Your protection. And may I ask why a Baron healer's assistant from a neutral background would be under the Alpha King's protection?" Caden said, "You may not." Conrad said, "That is a significant claim to make without explanation." Caden looked at him. He said, "I am aware. I am making it anyway." Another silence. Celine stood very still near the door and watched Conrad think. She could almost see the shape of his thoughts. He was working through the edges of this, looking for the angle that put him back in the position of advantage. He was good at it. She suspected he had been doing it for a very long time. He said slowly, "The Alpha King's protection is not a legal instrument in this context. The alliance terms are between Bloodmore and Ironclaw. A royal claim does not nullify a signed agreement." Caden said, "You are correct that it does not nullify the agreement. It does, however, create a complication that will need to be addressed before any further terms are executed. Which means the inspection results are, at present, suspended, pending that resolution." Conrad said, "And how long will that resolution take?" Caden said, "As long as it takes." Celine watched Conrad's jaw shift very slightly. He was not finished, she knew. He was simply choosing his moment. He said, "There is a tracker's report. It states that the woman shows signs inconsistent with a barren record. If the king is claiming her as a protected individual, it implies he has knowledge of the inconsistency." He paused, which raises the question of what, precisely, the king is protecting. The room held its breath. Caden looked across the table at Conrad for a long moment. Then he looked at Celine. She met his gaze. She saw the question in it. Not a demand, a question. He was asking if she was ready. She thought about what she had decided in her small house with the cold tea. She thought about the armor, and what it had cost her to wear it, and what it was costing her still. She thought about the two small lives that were not, at this point, a secret she was capable of protecting alone anymore. She gave him the smallest nod. He looked back at Conrad. He said, "What I am protecting is my own. That is all you need to know at this table." Conrad was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the careful precision of someone choosing a blade from a rack, "The Bloodmore Pack will require formal documentation of that claim before we accept the suspension of our inspection rights." Caden said, "You will have it." He said it the way he said most things, without emphasis, without performance, as if it were simply a fact being moved from one place to another. Conrad said, "And the healer who altered the registry?" Caden said, "Will face no action from this summit. His role in this matter is between him and his alpha, and it is not a matter for Bloodmore to adjudicate." Gregory, who had been silent for several minutes, said quietly, "I concur." Conrad looked between them. Then he looked at Celine, who had not moved from her place near the door and had not said a single word since entering the room. She met his gaze. She had learned, over the years, that the most unnerving thing she could give a person who expected her to be frightened was simple, uncomplicated steadiness. She gave him that now. Not defiance, not challenge, just a woman looking at another person without flinching. He looked away first. The summit continued for another 3 hours. Legal language was used. Frameworks were proposed and amended. Caden's lead counsel, who had been summoned from the capital and arrived by fast rider at the summit's second hour, worked through the language of the suspension clause with impressive speed and very precise handwriting. Celine sat in a chair along the wall, near Owen, who brought her water at some point, and did not comment on the fact that her hands were trembling slightly, just slightly, in her lap. When the session finally closed for the evening, when the hall emptied of everyone except Caden and Owen and 2 guards, Caden crossed the room to where she sat. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." He said, "That was not a small thing to be in the middle of." She said, "I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Conrad will not let this rest. He is going to look for a different angle." She said, "I know." He said, "Which is why I need you to agree to come back with me. Not as a request this time, as a genuine, specific recommendation, because I believe staying here increases the risk to you significantly." She looked at him. She said, "I already decided." He said, "When?" She said, "This afternoon. Before Owen came to the door, I was going to tell you in the morning, but morning seems to have been canceled." Something shifted in his expression. He said, "You were going to say yes." She said, "I was going to say yes with conditions." He said, "Tell me the conditions." She said, "Not tonight. Tonight I am tired, and I want to eat something and sleep in my own house for the last time, because I suspect I will not see it again for a long while." He said, "Fair." He walked her back to her house with Owen and 2 guards at a respectful distance. At her door, he paused. He said, "You held yourself very well in there." She said, "I have had practice." He said, "I know. I am sorry for that." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Do not be sorry for circumstances. Neither of us chose. Just make sure the conditions are honored." He said, "They will be." She went inside. She did not pack much. She had not brought much to this settlement, and she would not take much away from it. The bag she had packed 3 months ago for an emergency departure. A few things from the herb shelf that she valued, for reasons that had nothing to do with their usefulness. A small wrapped object that Dorian had given her years ago, a carved piece of pale wood in the shape of a bird, because he had made it himself and because he was one of the only people who had ever looked at her and seen a person rather than a circumstance. She slept, somehow, and woke before dawn, and was ready at the door when Owen came to collect her at first light. She took one look back at the small house. At the herb garden she had planted herself the first spring she arrived. At the window she had climbed through in a hurry. At the ordinary, modest, carefully managed life she had built as a cover story, and had lived inside so long that some of it had become real. Then she turned and walked toward the horses. The journey to the Rain Kingdom began on a cold morning with a gray sky. Celine rode beside Owen, not beside Caden, and that was her choice, because she needed a little more time before she was ready to sit beside him, in full view of his escort, and feel whatever it was she felt when he was close. He understood that without being told. She did not know yet how much she would come to rely on that. His ability to understand things without being told was not a skill she had expected in a man who wore a crown. But she had not expected much about him to be what she expected. They rode north. The settlement fell behind them. The open land spread out ahead, gray and cold and enormous. And in the space between her ribs, steady and warm, and utterly indifferent to everything that had happened, and everything that was still to come, two small lives went on humming their quiet, untroubled song. The Rain Kingdom received them without ceremony, which was what Caden had ordered, and what Celine had been relieved to hear. She had expected gates and gathered crowds, and the complicated performance of public arrival. Instead, they came in through the northern service entrance in the late evening, when the courtyard was empty, and the sky had gone the deep blue of early winter dusk, and the only people who met them were a small group of household staff who had clearly been instructed to be practical and quiet. Celine was given rooms in the western wing. They were larger than her entire house in the settlement, which was so disorienting that she stood in the middle of the main room for several minutes just looking at it. There was a fireplace with a fire already going. There was a window with a view of the walled garden below, which even in winter had the structured beauty of something that had been cared for consistently for a very long time. There was a desk, a reading chair, shelves that were empty and waiting, and a bed with more blankets on it than she had ever owned in her life. She unpacked her single bag. She placed the carved bird on the window ledge. She sat down in the reading chair and stared into the fire for a long time. A woman named Clara came in the morning. She introduced herself as Celine's assigned attendant, with a brisk, practical manner that Celine immediately respected. She did not ask questions. She brought breakfast, informed Celine of the morning schedule, and offered to show her the household library, the healer's workroom, and the garden paths at whatever time suited her. Celine said she would like to see the healer's workroom first. Clara looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of approval. She led the way. The workroom was located on the ground floor of the eastern wing. It was well supplied and well organized, smelling of dried botanicals and clean linen, with long counters and good light from high windows. The kingdom healer, a serious man named August, who was about 60 years old and had the hands of someone who had spent decades doing precise, careful work, was already there when they arrived. He shook Celine's hand, looked at her steadily, and said, "The king told me you have training." She said, 7 years as a healer's assistant, 3 of them working independently in a neutral settlement." He said, "What are your primary areas?" She said, "Pregnancy care, botanical remedies, wound management, and fever treatment." He said, "Good. I am short a capable person in this workroom. If you are willing, I would welcome your help when you feel able to give it." She said, "I would welcome the work." He nodded. That was the whole of the negotiation. She understood immediately that August was a person who communicated mostly through whether or not he was continuing to make eye contact with you, and that she had passed whatever initial test he had applied. The first week was quiet. Caden had been clear about that, she learned, through Clara, who relayed messages without editorializing. He had told the household that Celine was to be left to settle at her own pace, that she was not to be pressured into social obligations, and that her presence in the household was not to be discussed outside its walls. The political machinery was moving around her, she knew. She was not naive about that. Caden's lead counsel was working on the formal documentation that Conrad had demanded. There were likely letters being written, riders being sent, quiet conversations happening in rooms she was not in. The Bloodmore pack would not simply accept the suspension and let the matter rest. That was not how Conrad operated. But she had, for the first time in months, a door she could close. She used it. She worked in the healer's workroom in the mornings, where August taught her things she had not known, and she taught him a few things he had not known either, which earned her a particular kind of nod that meant real respect. She walked the garden paths in the afternoons when the weather allowed. She read in the evenings. She slept deeply for the first time in a very long time. She and Caden talked when their paths crossed, which was not every day. He had a kingdom to run, and she had not expected his constant presence, and she was not sure she wanted it yet. But when they did talk, they talked honestly, which was, She was finding the thing about him that she had not been prepared for. He did not talk around things. He did not use the language of careful indirection that she had grown up around in pack politics. He said what he meant, and then he waited to see what she said back, and if what she said back was inconvenient or complicated for him, he sat with it rather than dismissing it. She told him her conditions in their third conversation, in the small sitting room attached to the household library. She said, "I will stay here. I will accept your protection, and I will be honest with you, and I will do my best to figure out what the rest of this looks like. But I need you to understand that I am not going to be managed. I will not be given information on a need-to-know basis. Whatever is happening politically, whatever Conrad is planning, whatever documentation your council is drawing up, I want to know about it as it happens, not after the fact." Caden said, "Agreed," she said, "and when the children are born, the decisions about how they are raised, and where and what values they are given, are decisions I am part of, not presented with, part of." Caden said, "I would not have it any other way." She said, "And Dorian is not to face any consequences for what he did, not from Ironclaw, not from Bloodmore, and not from your kingdom." Caden said, "I have already ensured that." She said, "When?" He said, "Before we left the settlement." Gregory agreed, with some encouragement. Dorian has been quietly reassigned to a less visible position, which was his own preference, and the altered record has been formally withdrawn and replaced with a current accurate one, which means the original reason for its existence no longer applies. She looked at him. She said, "You handled that quickly." He said, "I had 4 months to think about what I would do differently. Once I understood what had been happening, I was prepared to move on several things at once." She said, "You had 4 months to think. You did not know where I was." He said, "No, but I knew I would find you eventually, and I preferred to have my thoughts in order when I did." She sat with that for a moment, the straightforward, uncomplicated certainty of it. She said, "That does not frustrate me as much as it perhaps should." He said, "Good." She said, "Don't be smug about it." He said, "I am never smug." She looked at him. He said, "Rarely smug." The conversation after that was easier. It was the first conversation they had that was not specifically about the situation, about politics or protection or logistics or the terms of her being here. It was just two people talking, the way they had talked at a ceasefire summit over a year ago, before everything became complicated. She did not tell him that she had thought about that conversation many times in the months between. She suspected he knew anyway. The complication arrived, as she had known it would, in the form of a formal letter from the Bloodmore Alpha, delivered to the Rain Kingdom 4 weeks into her stay. She was in the healer's workroom when August brought her the news. He told her that the king had received correspondence that morning and had asked, through Clara, whether she was available to meet that afternoon. She wiped her hands on a cloth, thanked August, and went to wash up. She went to the meeting. She sat across the desk from Caden in his study, which was a serious room with a great deal of documentation on every surface and one very large map of the Interpact territories pinned to the wall. He showed her the letter without preamble. She read it carefully. The Bloodmore Alpha, whose name was Raymond, and who wrote with the careful formality of someone who had learned to make aggression sound like procedure, was requesting a full formal review of the inspection results and demanding that the Rain Kingdom provide the documentation supporting its claim of protection over Celine Voss. He was also requesting that the kingdom confirm or deny whether the protected individual was in fact carrying the Alpha King's heirs, because if that was the case, it constituted a political development of significance to all interpack relations and could not be addressed through bilateral documentation alone. He was calling for a full interpack council. Celine put the letter down. She said, "He is not wrong that it constitutes a significant development." Caden said, "No, he is not." She said, "He is going to use the council to try to negotiate a position for Bloodmore. He wants something in exchange for dropping the inspection dispute." Caden said, "Yes, my council believes he will ask for trade route access and possibly a diplomatic representative at the palace." She said, "And if you say no?" Caden said, "He can ask for a council, but he cannot compel the outcome. The Alpha King's authority over intra-kingdom matters is not subject to interpack council review. He has legal standing to dispute the inspection suspension, but not to dictate what I do about you or the children. She said, but you are going to the council anyway. He said, yes, because avoiding it would look like weakness, and I am not in the business of looking weak when I have done nothing I need to conceal. She said, you will need the formal documentation before then. He said, it will be ready. She said, what does the documentation say, exactly? He looked at her across the desk. He said, it says that Celine Voss is the fated mate of the Alpha King of the Rain Kingdom and is carrying the royal heirs. Which is true. She said, the fated mate part. He said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, we have not discussed that part directly. He said, no, we have not. She said, are you about to? He said, I was waiting for you to be ready. She looked at the map on the wall, at the Interpact territories, all those careful lines and borders, and the names written in small formal lettering, the Ironclaw settlement, the Bloodmoor territory, the neutral lands in between. The Rain Kingdom, marked at the north, larger than most of the others. She said, I knew. When you walked in through that window at the ceasefire summit, I knew. He said, so did I. She said, and then I left anyway. He said, and then you left anyway. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that only existed between people who had run out of ways to be careful with each other. She said, I am not going to pretend that knowing changes everything overnight. It does not. There is still an enormous amount of distance between where we are and wherever we are supposed to end up. He said, I know. She said, but I am not going to keep pretending it means nothing either. That is a different kind of lie, and I am done with lying. He said, I know that too. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, the council. When? He said, 3 weeks. She said, I will be there. He said, you do not have to be. She said, I know I do not have to be. That is the point. I am choosing to be. There is a difference. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, yes, there is. She stood up. She straightened her coat. She looked at the letter sitting on the desk between them, at Raymond's careful aggression, dressed up in diplomatic language. She had spent so long hiding the pregnancy, hiding her location, hiding her connection to a man she could not simply cut out of the equation no matter how practical she tried to be about it. She was done hiding. The council was 3 weeks away. There were letters to write and logistics to arrange, and probably 100 other details that Caden's council was already worrying about in a room somewhere. She walked to the door. She paused. She said, August needs more dried feverfew. I am going to ask Clara to send someone to the market for it. Caden said, I will note that in the dispatch. She said, you do not need to note my herb requests in the royal dispatch. He said, I am being thorough. She said, you are being strange. He said, occasionally. She left the study. She walked back down the corridor toward the healer's workroom, her footsteps steady on the stone floor. 3 weeks to the council. She did not know exactly what Raymond would say there, or what Caden's council would argue, or how the pack representatives would respond to the information they would receive about her. But she knew this. She was not going to walk into that room as someone who needed defending. She was going to walk in as someone who had made every decision she made with clear eyes and a sound mind, and who was prepared to say so. The armor had been useful while she needed it. She did not need it anymore. The Interpack Council convened on a morning that was sharp with cold, the sky the pale flat gray of midwinter, the stone halls of the neutral council house drafty and lit by the kind of firelight that seemed to warm the room just barely enough to qualify as warming it. Celine wore dark gray. Clara had offered her several other options, including something with embroidery that would have announced her presence in the room before she had said a word, and she had declined politely. She needed to be seen today, not performed. She needed the people in that room to look at her and find a person rather than a symbol, and symbols tended to wear embroidery. She sat in the chair to the right of Caden's, which was not the chair his counsel had originally indicated for her. His counsel, a thorough man named Edmund, who had clearly never had to deal with anyone like her before, had suggested she sit to the side of the council table with the other non-representative observers. She had told him, with the kind of complete calm that left no room for negotiation, that she would sit at the table. Edmund had looked at Caden. Caden had said, "At the table." Edmund had adjusted the seating arrangement without further comment. Raymond's delegation arrived exactly on time, which told Celine something about the Bloodmore Alpha's personality. He was a man who valued the language of precision and punctuality. He understood that being exactly on time communicated control in a way that being early or late did not. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had seen enough weather to look permanently deliberate. He looked at Celine when he sat down. It was not a long look. It was an assessment, the kind that was over in a breath but collected a great deal of information. She met it without shifting in her seat. The council opened with formalities. A neutral representative, a woman named Harriet, who ran the proceedings with the efficient composure of someone who had mediated worse situations than this, and had the documentation to prove it, laid out the agenda. The inspection dispute, the suspension claim, the political implications of the Alpha King's statement of protection. And then, before Raymond could begin his opening argument, something unexpected happened. The door at the back of the hall opened, and Dorian walked in. Celine had not known he was coming. She did not show it, but she felt it. The sudden shift in her chest when she saw him, the old healer with his slow walk and his steady, quiet face, making his way to the observer's bench along the wall with a folder of documents under his arm. He met her gaze for a moment. He nodded once. She returned it. He had come to speak, on his own. She had not asked him. She had specifically not asked him, because she had not wanted to put him in the path of anything more dangerous than she had already caused him to face. He had come anyway. Raymond opened his argument efficiently. He spoke about the inspection terms, about the agreement with Ironclaw, about the falsified record and what it represented in terms of breach of contract. He was reasonable and precise, and he was careful not to be openly aggressive, because he was intelligent enough to know that open aggression in front of a neutral council would cost him more than it gained. Edmund presented the Rain Kingdom's formal documentation, 17 pages of careful legal language confirming Celine's status and the suspension of the inspection clause under royal protection. He walked through it section by section with the particular relish of a man who had put a great deal of work into something and was pleased to have the opportunity to explain it at length. Then Harriet asked if there were any additional statements for the record. Dorian stood up. He walked to the speaking position at the front of the room. He placed his folder on the podium. He looked at the council table. He said, "My name is Dorian. I am the senior healer of the Ironclaw settlement, and I have held that position for 31 years. I altered the fertility record of Celine Voss in the settlement registry at her request, 2 months before the Bloodmore inspection was conducted." The room was very quiet. He said, "I am making this statement voluntarily, without coercion, and with the full support of the Ironclaw Alpha, who is aware of my intention to speak today." He looked at Raymond. He said, "I am not here to debate the legality of what I did. I altered the record. That is a fact. I am here to explain the circumstances under which I made that decision, because I believe those circumstances are directly relevant to the Council's understanding of what the inspection policy was actually producing." He opened the folder. He had, over the previous weeks, Celine would later learn, compiled a quiet and meticulous record. Statements from 5 other settlements in the Interpact territories. 13 women who had been included in Bloodmore's inspection and taken under the alliance terms. Their names were known. Their circumstances before and after the transfers. He had written to neutral healers in 3 territories, gathered what information was available, and put it all in a folder with careful handwriting and precise dates. He presented it without drama. He read from it steadily, the way a healer read from a medical record, because that was what it was. By the 4th page, 2 of the council members had stopped taking notes and were simply listening. Raymond's expression had not changed, but his breathing had shifted. She could see it from where she sat. When Dorian finished, he closed the folder. He said, "I altered one record, and I would do it again. Not because I believe in breaking agreements casually, but because I believe that an agreement which treats people as resources to be distributed is not an agreement a healer can support in good conscience." He paused. "That is all I have to say." He returned to the observer's bench. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Harriet asked Raymond if he wished to respond. Raymond said, carefully, that the statements presented by the healer were unverified and outside the scope of the current dispute. Celine looked at him. Then she said, "May I speak?" Harriet said, "You may." Celine said, The statement presented by Dorian is unverified, because the women it concerns are not in this room. They are not in this room because they were not given the opportunity to choose whether to be here. That is the core of the issue. She looked at Raymond. You have presented this entire matter as a contract dispute. A woman's fertility record was altered. A settlement breached its inspection agreement. The Alpha King introduced a protection claim that complicated your legal position. These are the facts as you are framing them. She said, I would like to offer a different frame. A healer altered a document to protect a woman who had no other protection. A woman carried a difficult secret alone for months because the systems around her gave her no other option. And what is in that folder is a record of what happened to women who did not have a healer willing to do what Dorian did. She said, that is also a set of facts. I believe they are relevant. Raymond said, this council is not structured to evaluate the broader policy of the Bloodmore Alliance terms. Celine said, not yet. Raymond looked at her. It was a sharp look. She met it without moving. Harriet said, the chair will note that the documentation presented by the healer Dorian will be entered into the council record for further review. This council does have the authority to recommend policy review at the interpack level, and the chair intends to exercise that authority. Raymond said, that is beyond the scope of today's agenda. Harriet said, the chair determines the scope. There was a pause. Raymond looked at Caden. Caden looked back at him and said nothing. Raymond said, the Bloodmore Pack will require time to review the documentation and respond to the policy review recommendation. Harriet said, the Bloodmore Pack will have 30 days. The session continued for another 2 hours. By the end of it, the inspection suspension had been formally extended, the documentation of royal protection had been entered into the Interpack record, and the Fertility Bond Alliance policy had been flagged for a full Interpack review in the spring. Conrad, who had been seated behind Raymond throughout, had not said a single word. He had not needed to. He had watched the room shift around him, and he had understood, as intelligent people always understood, the moment when the ground beneath a strategy had changed. When the session closed, Celine stood, thanked Harriet, and crossed the room to Dorian. She said, you did not have to do that. He said, no, I did not have to. She said, thank you. He said, you were always a good healer. Do not let them make you forget that. She said, I will not. He patted her hand once, gathered his folder, and moved toward the door with his slow, steady walk. She watched him go. She did not try to stop the emotion that moved through her, because she was tired of performing composure in rooms that had not earned it. Caden came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He stood beside her, while the room emptied, and the fire burned low, and the gray winter light moved through the tall windows. Then he said, you were extraordinary in there. She said, I was honest. That is all. He said, sometimes that is the same thing. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, the policy review, in the spring. He said, I will ensure it moves forward. She said, that is the second condition. He said, I know. She said, what is the first? He said, the first was the one about not being managed. She said, right. I already decided you are not good enough at managing people to be particularly dangerous to me in that regard. He said, thank you. She said, that was not entirely a compliment. He said, I know. They left the council house together, stepping out into the cold air and the flat gray sky. The escort was waiting. The horses stamped quietly in the cold. She stopped at the top of the steps. She looked out at the Interpack road stretching away to the north, away to home, which was a word she had not used in some time, and was only just beginning to try on again. She said, the journey back. I would like to ride beside you today. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I would like that. She walked down the steps. She accepted a hand up from one of the guards and settled into the saddle. She waited while Caden mounted beside her. They rode north together. The landscape was cold and spare and enormous. The road was empty except for their group, the hoofbeats steady and quiet on the hard ground. She was not afraid. She was not hiding. She was not performing anything. She was simply there, on a winter road, carrying two lives that hummed their warm and indifferent song inside her, riding beside a man who was complicated and careful and not quite what she had expected, toward a home that was still becoming familiar. The spring council would happen. The policy review would happen. There would be more letters and more arguments and more rooms full of people who had opinions about her life that she had not requested. She was ready for all of it. The twins were born in late summer, just past the full moon, in the large, well-lit room that August had prepared with characteristic thoroughness 3 weeks in advance. He had 2 assistants, a supply of everything he might need, and a detailed plan that, like all detailed plans, was immediately departed from in several significant ways by the actual process of events. Celine had managed it, as she managed most things, with focused attention and a refusal to be overwhelmed by any individual moment of difficulty until she had the capacity to deal with it. Caden had been in the room. She had not asked him to be there. She had also not asked him not to be. He had stood where August told him to stand, and he had not gotten in the way, which was the highest praise she could offer any person in that situation. When it was over, when the room had settled into the quiet that followed a great deal of work, and August had done everything he needed to do, and stepped back with the expression of a man who was professionally satisfied, Caden sat in the chair beside her and looked at the 2 small people she was holding. He did not say anything for a long time. She said, "They are both here." He said, "Yes." She said, "Both strong." He said, "Yes." She looked down at them, 2 faces, new to the world, entirely uninterested in the political landscape they had just been born into. She said, "I thought of names." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Vale and Dawn." He was quiet. Then, he said, "One for the dark that hid them." She said, "And one for the light they were born into." He looked at her. Something in his face was very open in that moment, more open than she had seen it. She looked back at him without looking away. He said, "Yes." The Kingdom Healer recorded the births. The formal documentation was prepared and witnessed. Letters went out to the Interpack Council, to the settlement representatives, to the neutral collective, to the various political parties who had been waiting for this particular piece of information with various degrees of patience. In the spring, as Caden had promised, the Interpack Policy Review convened. Celine attended. She spoke. Harriet chaired it with the same efficient composure she brought to everything. The Fertility Bond Alliance structure was formally dissolved, replaced with a revised framework that required voluntary consent documentation for any alliance arrangement involving individuals of any kind. It was not a perfect outcome. It was a beginning. Raymond signed it without grace and with the precision of a man who understood he had no remaining ground to argue from. Conrad was not in the room for the signing. No one mentioned his absence. The bonding ceremony happened on a quiet evening in the household garden, with the formal witnesses required by law and almost no one else. Edmund had prepared documentation that was thorough to the point of being, Celine felt, slightly excessive, but she had signed it with a steady hand and made him feel appreciated for the work regardless. Caden had not made a speech. He had looked at her, and she had looked at him, and they had said the words they were required to say, and then a few they were not required to say, and that had been the whole of it. She wore something simple. She had declined the crown that Edmund had indicated would be expected of her at the ceremony. She had looked at him and said, "I will wear a crown when I am ready to wear a crown. Today is not that day." Edmund had opened his mouth. Caden had said, "She will wear a crown when she is ready." Edmund had nodded and made a note. She wore the crown 6 months later, at the formal public ceremony that the kingdom had been anticipating since the news of the twins spread. By that point, she had had enough time to understand what wearing it meant, to be certain it was something she was choosing, rather than something being placed on her head by circumstance. She stood in the great hall with Vale and Dawn in the care of their nurses in the front row, and she held herself straight and let the weight of the medal settle on her head, and she felt, for the first time and longer than she could easily measure, that the shape of her life and the shape of herself were the same. The healer who had altered her record lived quietly in a small house near the eastern settlement border. He had a garden and a new apprentice and the uncomplicated peace of a person who had done one significant thing at some cost and found it worth the cost. He received letters from Celine regularly. He sent back letters that were shorter, because he was a man of few written words, but precise in what they said. In the first letter he received from her after the bonding ceremony, she had written, among other things, that August was insufferable in the best possible way, and that she was grateful for every piece of it. He had written back one line. He wrote, "Good. Stop being so far away." She had laughed when she read it. Caden, who was across the room working on correspondence of his own, had looked up. She said, "Dorian." He said, "What did he say?" She said, "He told me to stop being so far away." Caden said, "Invite him." She said, "He will not come." Caden said, "Invite him anyway." She wrote the invitation. Dorian declined, as predicted, with polite warmth and a suggestion that she visit him instead when she had the time. She went the following summer, with Vale and Dawn and a small escort that she kept as small as possible, and sat in his garden in the afternoon sun, and he made tea that was slightly too strong and she drank it all. And they did not talk about any of the large things that had happened. They talked about herbs and the garden and what her daughters could do with their hands at their age, which was apparently impressive for developmental reasons that Dorian explained in detail. She drove back in the evening through the Interpack Road, and the road was just a road, and the land was just land, and the life behind her and the life ahead of her were the same life, finally, for the first time. She pressed her hand to the window glass, feeling the cold of it, and looked out at the sky going gold above the tree line. The names had been right, Vale and Dawn. One for the dark that kept them safe, one for the light they walked into. Both of them hers. All of it, finally, hers.